They came with guns, flags, and arrogance. But one African emperor would rewrite the rules of resistance. His name? Menelik II, the man who shattered an empire's illusion of invincibility at the Battle of Adwa. The late 19th century was a brutal chapter in African history. European powers were tearing the continent apart, drawing borders with ink and blood in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. Colonies were claimed, kingdoms erased, and resistance crushed. But in the highlands of East Africa, one nation stood apart. Ethiopia wasn't a blank space on a European map. It was ancient, with emperors tracing their lineage to King Solomon. It had its own script, faith, diplomacy, and fiercely independent spirit. Italy, eager to prove itself alongside colonial giants like Britain and France, set its sights on Ethiopia. It saw conquest as inevitable. But Ethiopia had Menelik II, and he wasn't about to let his people become a footnote in someone else's empire. Before the world would know his name as the emperor who stood against a European empire, Menelik II was simply Solomarium, born in 1844 in Ankober, the highlands of Shua. From birth, his destiny was caught in the storm of Ethiopian politics and the shifting sands of African power. Menelik was no ordinary prince. As the son of King Haile Melekot of Shua, he was taken hostage as a child by Emperor Tewodros II, a common political tactic of the time. But rather than wither in captivity, young Menelik grew sharp, listening, observing, calculating. When he escaped years later, he didn't return just to reclaim his title. He returned with a vision. By the 1870s, Menelik had consolidated power as the king of Shua. But his ambition reached further. He outmaneuvered rivals, forged critical alliances, and unified the fractured regions of Ethiopia. In 1889, following the death of Emperor Johannes IV, Menelik rose as the new emperor, not by brute force alone, but by his unmatched political foresight. But Menelik knew unity wasn't enough. If Ethiopia was to survive the wave of European imperialism crashing over Africa, it had to modernize, fast. Under his rule, Ethiopia transformed. In 1889, Menelik II signed the Treaty of Wuchal with Italy. On the surface, it seemed harmless. Italy would recognize Ethiopia's sovereignty, and in return, Menelik would acknowledge their presence in Eritrea. But hidden in the treaty's Article 17 was a trap, two versions of the same document, one in Italian, the other in Amharic. In the Italian version, Menelik supposedly agreed to make Ethiopia a protectorate under the King of Italy. But in the Amharic version, no such clause existed. It was a deliberate deception, a colonial trick straight from the European playbook. Menelik was no fool. When the ruse came to light, he didn't panic, he mobilized. Across the Ethiopian highlands, he sent out emissaries. He reached out to the Russians, the French, buying weapons, gathering warriors. He saw through Italy's ambitions, understood their arrogance, and knew war was inevitable. He declared to the world, "I am the emperor of a free people." And so what began as a diplomatic handshake became the first drumbeat of a war that would stun Europe. As dawn broke on March 1, 1896, Ethiopia was no longer just a name on a map. It was the last stand of African sovereignty. Menelik II had gathered a massive force, nearly 100,000 strong, including warriors from every corner of the empire. Italy, expecting an easy conquest, sent only 17,000 troops, mostly underprepared and poorly informed. What they didn't realize was that Ethiopia wasn't just fighting for territory. It was fighting for dignity, survival, and history itself. The world held its breath. Would this be another colonial massacre, or the beginning of something no one expected? Menelik and his wife, Empress Tetu, had prepared meticulously. They had studied Italian positions, used scouts and terrain to their advantage, and divided their armies to flank and surround the enemy. The Italians, confused and isolated, were forced into rough, mountainous ground where cannons were useless and cavalry collapsed. Tetu herself led thousands of troops, commanding not just by title, but by fire. The battle was swift, brutal, and poetic. Italy's lines broke, and their dreams of empire shattered on Ethiopian soil. The result was staggering. Thousands of Italian troops lay dead or captured. European newspapers were stunned. An African nation had defeated a European empire in direct combat. The victory echoed far beyond Adwa. It became a beacon for black liberation movements across the world. Ethiopia remained free and sovereign, the only African country not colonized during the scramble for Africa. And Menelik II? He became a symbol of unbending resistance, forever etched into the story of African pride. At Adwa, history wasn't just made, it was rewritten. Menelik II didn't just defeat an empire, he left behind a blueprint. A blueprint for unity, strategy, and dignity in a world where Africa was being carved up like spoils of war. His reign proved that modernization does not mean westernization. He adopted railroads and telegraphs, yes, but kept Ethiopia's cultural and religious identity intact. He built alliances, played rivals against each other, and negotiated like a chess master, all while staying grounded in the needs of his people. Even after his death in 1913, Menelik's influence lingered. Ethiopia became a symbol of freedom during the era of African independence. The victory at Adwa was studied, invoked, and honored by leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and Malcolm X. It fed the Pan-African imagination, a reminder that resistance wasn't futile. But perhaps the greatest lesson Menelik left is this. True leadership is knowing when to make peace, when to build, and when to fight, not for ego, but for your people's future. He was called many things: emperor, warrior, unifier, visionary. But history remembers him by one name above all: the Lion of Africa. The Battle of Adwa wasn't just a war. It was a message that Africa would not kneel quietly. At the center of it all stood Menelik II, not just an emperor, but a symbol of courage, strategy, and dignity. His legacy lives on in every act of resistance, every dream of freedom. Because one victory in 1896 echoed across centuries. If this story moved you, there's more where it came from. Tap subscribe and join us as we uncover the forgotten realms of history, battles, legends, and truth untold.